Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the pedagogy of politics. What can research tell us about the diverse ways in which we can teach about politics? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. How should we teach about politics? How, if at all, should teaching politics be different from teaching hard sciences such as physics or arts and humanities subjects such as history or English, or indeed other social sciences such as economics or sociology? The territory of politics is inherently contested. So should we embrace that contestation in our teaching, or should we stick to known facts? These and many other questions are explored by a new centre within the UCL Department of Political Science called the UCL Centre for the Pedagogy of Politics. It held its inaugural seminar last month, looking at the role of emotion in teaching politics. It's already held another event exploring how to teach research methods in politics, and it has many more events and projects planned. And I'm delighted to be joined by two of its founders and co-directors. Dr. Cathy Elliott is Associate Professor teaching in Qualitative Methods and the Politics of Nature in the UCL Department of Political Science, as well as our graduate tutor. And Dr. J.P. Salter is lecturer teaching in public policy, again in the UCL Department of Political Science, and he's also our Deputy Director of Education. Welcome, Cathy and J.P. to UCL Uncovering Politics. Indeed, welcome back, Cathy, because we had a great podcast with you last year when we were exploring your work on decolonising the curriculum. So let's dive straight in here and start with a big question. To you, Cathy, first. Why did you want to set up the Centre for the Pedagogy of Politics?
Well, thanks for having us on. So we've ended up in a situation at the moment in the department, partly through luck, where we have quite a lot of colleagues who are really interested in pedagogy. And that is partly to do with the fact that UCL has this career path around education-focused academics, which is a dream job for me. So I'm very excited about that. And we've hired a lot of people on that path. So we've got a kind of critical mass of people who are very interested in researching pedagogy and thinking about it, writing about it, and specifically within our discipline. But not actually only restricted to them, also more broadly people on all sorts of different paths, including our PhD students, really interested in the pedagogy of politics. And so me and JP and our other co-directors, Kalina Zhekova and Noel Crossley, we sat down together and we thought, well, it would be really nice to work together to try and think together through some of this stuff, because even though there's quite a lot of diversity in how we think about politics and pedagogy, we're all interested in teaching politics. And so we looked over to our friends in economics, and they have got this Centre for the Teaching and Learning of Economics, which is very well established and successful by now. It's been around for a long time. And we thought we could do that. So we decided that we'd set up a centre just as a kind of focal point for thinking about the pedagogy of politics. And we bid for some money. We got a couple of small grants to help us get up and running, which I think is nice, not just because of the money, but also because it sort of made us feel as if, yes, this is something that people are interested in, there's support for this. And so, yeah, that's where we are right now, just sort of starting out.
And JP, I guess the question that arises from that is, what's particular about the pedagogy of politics compared with the pedagogy of economics, say? I mean, most fundamentally, that gets us to the question of what actually are we doing when we teach politics, and indeed, what is politics? What's our focus here?
As you said in your intro, it's an inherently contested field, and we don't see ourselves. We're not pitching ourselves as a centre or as a unit which can have ambitions to answer definitively what is this thing called politics that we are teaching. And instead, we take the view that what we are engaged in, or what we are helping to facilitate, is research into the pedagogy of politics, and in particular, helping get to grips with what we understand as the key way, or the real way in which politics is taught, which reflects in turn what this thing called politics is. What we are getting to is the idea that politics should be taught through a medium of situated learning, as we call it. So rather than some kind of model whereby we convey some expertise to students and they learn this expertise and they then become knowers of things. Instead, we're in a world where, or in an educational environment where we are learning by doing this thing called politics, and we are learning by continually navigating our way through this contested space and trying to work out for ourselves as researchers. This is something that we deal with all the time, but as students, we should be dealing with all the time. And my point here is that we don't think this is something which can be closed off and boundaried and delineated and defined and then conveyed in a very sort of top-down model. And instead, it's something which needs to be taught in a much more organic and fluid and inclusive setting.
The thing about the centre is, right, if you think about politics as a discipline, right, rather than politics as an activity that people get engaged with when they go vote and so on, right, politics as a discipline, as a field of study in the UK, as JP's just said, it's very diverse, right? If you think about different politics departments in the UK, some have sort of joint honours degrees with history and politics, where politics is thought of as a very sort of historical thing. Some people are much more engaged in political theory and the philosophy of politics. Other departments are very focused on kind of empirical work, maybe very focused on quant and statistics. Other people are focusing on more critical approaches to politics, so very contested field. And so actually, when we're talking about how do we teach politics, sometimes those conversations become quite difficult, quite antagonistic. And the reason for that is because we're actually having a conversation about who we are as a discipline, what we want novices to know, what we want future academics in political science departments to know, right? So that's what kind of brings us to this idea that students sort of learn through the process of being part of an academic community. So in a way, our centre is around sort of having some conversations about that. What do we want people to know? Bringing people in, and we will all have different ideas about that. So JP and I kind of agree on this idea of situated learning, but there'll be plenty of people who want to come to our seminars who may take a different view, and that's great, because I think that the point of it is to have a discussion. But what we think is, so just as when I was young and I was learning the clarinet, or I know when you were young, Alan, and you were learning the flute, right?
Yes.
We would we weren't good enough to be in a proper orchestra. I'm still not, right? But we would play in a youth orchestra. Yeah. So you would be engaged in the kind of peripheral apprenticeship work of learning that craft. Right? So what I think teaching and learning is about is bringing students into the community of scholars who are doing the work of researching politics and enabling them to do that work, but at that kind of peripheral level, the kind of youth orchestra level, if you like. And then gradually, as they go through that kind of apprenticeship, then they get better and better at it. And so they start doing the sorts of things that we do. And so I think knowledge is always a sort of practical thing. It's always something that we're doing, even if what we're doing is sitting in rooms talking about what knowledge is, right? We're still doing something, and we're still doing that in relationship with other people. So to me, pedagogy follows from that imparting knowledge to students involves getting them involved in having those relationships in which they are engaging in knowledge practices, which may involve sitting in rooms talking about what knowledge is, but may involve other things as well, such as running regressions, or doing a research design, or writing something very normative, or doing what you do, Alan, running a deliberative session. All sorts of different things they could be doing, and so that's kind of how me and JP think about what teaching politics is, I think.
But it's interesting that you, Kathy, there are talking very much about teaching the discipline of politics, and I'm just thinking, if you teach dancing, then you actually dance.
Yes.
And if you teach clarinet playing, then you actually play the clarinet. If you teach politics, we don't go down to the polling station, or we don't sit in the parliamentary chamber. We don't kind of do politics. So you were talking about what we're teaching as being the discipline of political science or political studies rather than politics as such. Is that fair?
I think it can be both, but so when thinking about how we teach the discipline of politics, then students can get involved in doing the research on politics, right? They can be involved in doing the things that we do as researchers of politics. But that's not to say that as an undergraduate or postgraduate student, you might not also be interested in learning about politics because you want to be a politician, or you want to work in a think tank or something like that. So absolutely, it's great to get students involved in that kind of apprenticeship work as well. And some of the members of our centre are really interested in ideas about sort of employability and how transferable students' degrees will be to this kind of so-called outside world, which actually, of course, is completely sort of interlinked and interpenetrated with the academic world. These two things aren't separate. So yes, I think we can absolutely do both of those things, and hopefully the sorts of skills that you develop doing the one will help you with the other. Right. So being able to sit in rooms talking about what knowledge is actually a very useful skill to have if you need to go and give evidence to a select committee or explain why a particular policy might work better than another policy and so on. These things are not separate.
And I guess I'm often thinking of when I'm teaching that I'm kind of teaching about how to be a good citizen.
Exactly. So, that's exactly where I was about to go. In that, so you mentioned we don't trundle down to the polling station and vote, but I think there is far more to the business of living and breathing and existing politics, being in politics, than the act of trundling down to a polling station and voting. It's about understanding others' views and perspectives and reconciling them against your own, and about having robust conversations with them over disagreements and learning how to get along with each other. And it's about learning about what numbers can tell us and what numbers can't tell us, and what discourses can tell us and what discourses can't, and so on and so on. And all of these things, all of these skills that we hope to develop in our students through our teaching of politics, train them, enable them to be politically aware, politically competent citizens of the world, right? More than just people that once every 4 years trundle down to the polling station and vote, but people who are constantly and consistently aware of their political surroundings and navigating their way through them and interacting with others in a sort of sensible and coherent way.
And JP, how would you characterize how politics is taught today? Are there common pathologies in the way in which politics is taught in universities today? Well,
let me caveat this slightly with a statement that this is very much a sort of a personal observation and a personal impression, and there'll be people that think very differently about how politics is taught. But my sense is that we tend to teach politics in too much of a sort of expert-led, teacher-led fashion, in that we tend to have a setup where somebody knows a lot of things about something, and their role is to impart the knowledge about this something to other people that don't know so much about that thing. And then at the end of this 10-week-long module, these people know more about this thing. And that comes through in the way that we define the boundaries of the things that we are teaching. When we say we have a module on X, we draw boxes around X and use our own intuition position in that space to do that boundarying. And it comes across in the way that we deliver lectures, and the way that we run seminars, and the way that we construct curricula. It's a sort of top-down and expert-driven process. Whereas, and that feels like it's at odds with what Kathy and I have been talking about, whereby what we ought to be doing is having, firstly, a more sort of open-ended view of our discipline and of our pocket within the discipline, and secondly, much more of a sort of coaching approach. I'll come back to this later when I talk about my research, but much more of a coaching approach, whereby rather than me telling you lots of things that I know that you don't yet know, I think we ought to be guiding students through this process of kind of becoming apprentice political scientists, or novice political scientists, and apprentice and novice members of an informed political community, such that over the course of our teaching, they may well come away learning new things that they didn't previously know about whatever X was, but they are also better able to think, to navigate the world, to interact with each other, to deal with other contested areas or difficult viewpoints, or whatever it might be.
And presumably this reflects something of the difference between politics and at least some other disciplines. So I'm guessing in physics, say, or in economics, indeed, there's more kind of top-down expert stuff to be done. Kathy wants to contest this claim.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't agree. So to me, it's the same thing, right? You're asking students who are doing maths or physics or whatever it might be, you're also asking them to come into the classroom and do whatever it is that mathematicians do, right? So they're learning how to do that. So it's not a case of somebody standing at the board, hopefully, right, writing a lot of equations and now you know how to write an equation, right? You've got to learn how maths works, which means you've got to do maths as a member of the maths community.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite similar, actually, in terms of the pedagogy of it.
Yeah, my youngest brother is at medical school now, and my intuitive thought was that medicine must be taught in a large room with a man in a white coat at the front pointing at a skeleton and saying,
or maybe a woman,
or maybe a woman, indeed. But actually, the way that he is being taught medicine is much more like our situated learning sort of model, whereby he's dragged around a ward by a doctor they are told not only a load of content stuff, like here is the tib and here is the fib and so on, but also things like, I will show you how to wash your hands. I will show you how to open the door with your elbow so you don't contaminate things. A whole load of peripheral bits and pieces of soft knowledge, of soft skills, which all combine to eventually make them better doctors, well-trained doctors. And so I think this idea that there are disciplines which can be taught in a very sort of top-down, expert-driven ways is not quite right.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to some of these big questions later on in the podcast, but let's explore some of the particular projects that you're focusing on for now. So, Kathy, as I said at the start, we have had you on the podcast before talking about your work, your fascinating work on decolonizing the curriculum. And listeners who want to know more about that can find the episode from our very first season back in December 2020. And the episode was called Decolonizing the University. But another strand of your work focuses on how we, including students, see the world and respond to it, and how we can use that how we can think about that in our teaching. And one example that you've written about is a trip that you do with your students to an art exhibition, which might be slightly unexpected in the context of teaching politics. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and what you're trying to do there and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I teach a lot about sort of the visual in one way or another. And this particular class is a kind of critical class on international development studies sort of thing. And so I get students who come to that class who already know lots of things about international development. And a lot of the things that they know comes from the images that they've seen, right? So if you imagine, I always ask sort of the first exercise in class, I say to students, imagine a developing country and tell me what that's like. And you can immediately know from the kind of words that come out of their mouths what sort of photos they've been looking at, what sort of images they've seen, right? So emaciated children with flies on their faces, famine, squalor, misery, all this kind of thing, right? And quite often the images that they've seen as well will have sort of black and brown bodies in abject suffering, and then capable white bodies helping. So you can see this intersect a lot with the work I've done on sort of racism and decolonizing the curriculum. It's fairly obvious. So what I want them to be able to do is look at those images in a different way and be able to offer a kind of creative, theoretical interpretation of what's going on in those images, informed by literature and so on. And so the way I do that is to try and show them that these images have a history. Because actually, if you look at an image from now, it's so familiar you don't see it. But if you look at an image like a work that we have in the UCL Art Museum, which is a sketch of a countess, absolutely beautiful, all her beautiful clothes and everything, and then just next to her is a little black child, a servant or an enslaved child. We don't exactly know. We don't know anything about this child really. And he is there presented as this kind of, he's another decoration. He's next to her vase, he's next to her beautiful curtains, but he's basically just another decoration for her. And so if you look at that with students and then you say to them, it's interesting, isn't it, what a long history there is of images of white women making themselves look good by sitting next to black children, then suddenly that's a kind of a shocking experience for them and an interesting experience for them, and it helps them reinterpret, the Angelina Jolie or Madonna pictures that they've seen, or perhaps the pictures that they've taken of themselves, the selfies that they've done on their gap years. So that's what I'm doing with that exhibition, and there's about 9 images in it, so it's not massive. We spend quite a lot of time looking at each one. And they explore intersecting themes of ideas about deserving and undeserving poor. So what does it mean for people to be stigmatized for being poor, perhaps because they don't or can't work? And how poverty hasn't always been thought of in that way. So we've got some older images where poverty is sort of conceptualized in quite a different way, which again can be quite a shocking experience to realize that what you think poverty is isn't necessarily eternal or universal. It's something that's constructed. And then these ideas about race and racism and poverty. And we have some quite distressing images in there as well, including an image from the 1830s around the emancipation of the slaves and the way that was thought of at the time, which was not about human rights or anything. There were some quite sort of dark ideas around the time about what the emancipation of the slaves meant and what it meant particularly for English people. And that particular image is very racist, and so therefore very useful for students to look at and understand the history of how we think about this kind of the civilizing, if you like, work that in inverted commas that development practitioners do.
And I'm interested in the process that you go through with the students here. And I guess one question that comes to my mind is the kind of physicality of the process. You actually go to the gallery, so you could just have them in a seminar group with the images up on slides and go through the slides and see what reactions people have. What difference does it make actually to go to the gallery space?
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because it would be such a different experience to do it with the slides. So being in the gallery space partly means that you can get close to the images, and you can see, so it's a privilege, right, to be in a space with a Rembrandt. So students are excited by that. They like to go in and look at the Rembrandts, and they enjoy the fact that they're not allowed to take their biro because they don't want to be the person that got a biro mark on the priceless Rembrandts and all of that. So it's an enjoyable experience to go to an art gallery, right? Everybody knows that. And so the students kind of come there with a kind of mindset of, yes, we're here to learn, but it's a sort of nice experience. They can stay for as long as they like. So the exhibition's open for 4 hours. Mostly they stay for about half an hour, but I will always get some students who'll spend the full 4 hours there, and they'll sit on the floor and they'll draw. So I tell them, if you want to really look closely at these images, sketch them. And so some will sit on the floor and draw the pictures, draw the works. And they also spend a lot of time just talking to me, which is nice because we can have those very small group chats. And a few students will gather around me and we'll look in detail at one picture. And then when we've kind of exhausted it and everybody's gone a bit quiet, I'll just sort of slip away and talk to another group. So that's very nice. So it's kind of convivial. So it also means they're talking to each other. And there's a lot of movement. You're moving around. So rather than sitting in static chairs, having a group work with the person you always sit next to, you're moving around. You're meeting different people. You're having different conversations. And that's, I think, particularly useful at the moments when it becomes quite emotionally charged, because it means you can walk away and then you can come back. And so sometimes we're having quite hard conversations about racism, and I'll notice a student, it may particularly be students of colour, will just sort of slip off for a moment and then come back in a bit later when they're ready for it, which is really nice. So altogether, it's a very different experience going to an art gallery rather than sitting in a classroom. I really like it.
So there's a lot going on in that space while you're there. Yeah. And then I think, if I'm right, you also then have a discussion a couple of days later in a kind of more traditional teaching context. Is that right?
That's right. And in fact, the discussion goes on across the whole term. So this idea of becoming critical consumers of images is something that we keep coming back to sort of repetitively through the term. And the final assessment is to do a discourse analysis of some kind of development type document. It can be anything. And a lot of students will choose images, popular culture, charity adverts, that kind of thing. Yeah, but all the rest of that discussion is indeed happening in the classroom.
That's a project that you've been doing for a number of years. I think at the moment you're working particularly, aren't you, on the role of emotion in teaching politics? And indeed you mentioned the emotions that can be involved in the gallery visit. What are the ideas that you're exploring at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, it comes out of that module because such a lot of strong emotions do come up as part of that module. And I found that students were sort of saying to me, when I asked them what they'd learned, they said, I've had an emotional transformation. It's changed the way I see things. It's changed the way I feel. It's changed the relationships that I'm in with other people. And that got me to thinking and then reading about sort of what the role of emotion is in knowledge. And I think there is a sort of a folk theory almost, there's an idea that goes around amongst people that maybe haven't thought about it very much, that rationality and emotion are two sort of different things, and that in classrooms we should be rational. And so I think teachers, when people talk to me about teaching, they're often worrying a lot about showing their emotions in classrooms or being emotional or acknowledging emotion. They try and make sure that emotion is sort of out the door. Students are protected from all that, or it doesn't infiltrate, and that we have a sort of rational debate. And some of the literature on kind of deliberative spaces also sort of engages in that, right? That we should try and keep the emotion outside and just bring our rational selves. And I suppose what has emerged from my teaching is that actually my feeling that isn't what knowledge is, that isn't what rationality is. Rationality always has an emotional component to it. And so actually it's very important that we acknowledge that and we understand that that's going on in our classrooms. So we can't make moral evaluations. We can't decide which side of an argument we're on without consulting the emotional responses we have, for example. Emotions are always part of any kind of rational conversation. And therefore, it's a good idea to be engaged with that when we're teaching and when we're learning. And there are various ways of thinking about this. So some people think, oh, well, the best thing to do to motivate students is make sure that they're having the correct emotions when they're in the classroom, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it might be to try and train students to have the right sort of emotions to be resilient and do well in the world and succeed in their exams. Yeah. I don't think about it like that. I also don't think that the classroom is a therapy session, right? So, I mean, I deal with a lot of emotions in my work, as you know, and I have students with extenuating circumstances overwhelmingly come to me, and that can be more of a kind of let's just talk about it and we'll all feel better kind of conversation. Classrooms aren't, I think, like that. It's not about therapy. It's also not about excluding emotions. It's about having a critical and theoretical response to what our emotions are doing. So, and again, bringing that back to decolonizing the curriculum, right? If I confront you with all these racist images and I say, this is what our wealth, this is what our prosperity, this is what our university is built on, you might feel as a student, you might feel sort of defensive or angry about that, right? So what I want to do is not validate that anger, but ask or say that it's wrong and that it should go outside, right? I want to ask, what is that anger doing, right? That anger is very political. That anger is doing political work. Are you able to analyze that? Are you able to notice it? Are you able to notice when other people are engaged in it? And are you able to develop a theoretical response to that anger or whatever other emotion it is you might be feeling to show how emotions are always part of the politics of our lives? So that's kind of where I'm focusing on. And I've done some work getting my students to write responses to the work they've done on the module to kind of explain to me how emotions help them learn. And what they all say is, yes, actually it was what I felt about a reading was the most telling thing to me. That was what helped me learn. One student said the thing was my brain was fuming, which I really liked. I hope all my students' brains are fuming by the time they've taken my class.
And presumably, given again what you were saying earlier, you think this applies whatever it is that we're teaching?
Yes. Yes, absolutely,
so,
right.
I'm guessing someone who teaches, intro to statistics might think that there's not a lot of emotion there, or any emotion that there might be is just getting in the way. But that's not your view at all.
That's not my view at all, right? So, and I think there's two things going on there. So firstly, when I ran a little workshop for people who are dealing with difficult emotions in their classrooms, most of the people who came were people teaching sort of engineering and statistics and maths, whose students are all really cross with them because they find it hard. So it's partly that, right? I think you can't get on with your work until you've sort of had an acknowledgement that there is some emotion here and people are finding it hard, and that's important. But I think more fundamentally than that, statistics and numbers have a history, and some people are more acutely aware of that history than others. But lots of people are excluded by numbers, right? So there's now quite a big literature on things like queer data, indigenous statistics, interpretive quantification, the history of eugenics and how that's related to statistics, which show that the way that we create numbers, those numbers which live in sort of R and starter and all of this, the way we create those numbers actually involves people, and it involves condensing people's experiences in particular ways which maybe represent white people better than black people, men better than women, and so on, and don't necessarily engage with people's own experiences of the world. And so actually that's a very emotional subject. We could teach about that. I mean, I think anyone teaching about statistics at UCL should absolutely teach about eugenics and the fact that statistics emerges from this history of eugenics, right? And then immediately that then becomes at UCL, right? And you could use the Galton collection to do that, right? You could use UCL collections. So I mean, I think there's always emotion in all of these things. And actually, unless we acknowledge it, then we're not getting actually to the root of where our knowledge practices are coming from.
Fascinating. JP, you have been doing some work on teaching research methods in politics, and indeed that session that I mentioned at the start in the last CPP seminar was on research methods.
That's right. Yeah. So I think this stems from what I was saying earlier about how our role as educators, our role as teachers in universities, is to bring people into this community of practice, bring people into this sort of group of where we do research, because it's through engaging with literature and engaging with theory and engaging with the world as researchers, as novice researchers, that students get to grips with all of those things better and become potentially better social scientists and potentially eventually maybe junior academics and so on up that tree, or they become just better critically informed, critically capable citizens of the world, either of which are good outcomes. And from that, what we are interested in, I'm working on something with Indranil Sarkar at the moment, who's another in the centre, is the way that we teach research methods and research design in. We began by looking at postgraduate public policy degrees, but actually the more we look at this, the more we think it may be better to broaden this to politics in general and to under and postgraduate work. But we're interested in the way that we as a discipline teach research methods and research design. And what seems to have struck us, and this is not a commentary on the way we do things in our department, this is general observations which are motivating the study. But what seems to have struck us is that we are good at teaching research methods, as in, here are some numbers, this is the best way in which to analyze those numbers, and now you can all go away and do this clever regression on those numbers. Or what we are going to teach you today is how to conduct an elite interview. But what we don't seem to be as good at doing is teaching research design, and indeed the very first steps of research design, which is critically engaging, critically analyzing an extant literature on a topic and identifying something in that extant literature which is either hasn't been done or which has been done but unsatisfactorily, using an inappropriate method operationalization of something, or an inappropriate or old data or something like this, and going from that initial there's something to be done here, to a question, to a thorough engagement with the philosophy of knowledge which is associated with that question. So am I asking a how or a what or a why question or a meaning question? And what do those different types of questions mean for different ontological and epistemological positionings between me and this pre-existing body of knowledge that there is? And how do I hope to contribute to this thing or advance this thing? We don't do very much teaching of that end of things. And so what we find is that students, when it comes to dissertation season, which funnily enough is kind of about now, students find themselves often a little at sea because they can't find, they don't know how to approach the literature and to synthesize it and to find themselves a gap and find themselves a niche and get themselves with the very, very beginning points of it. This is a question which I could answer. These are the philosophical implications of that question, and therefore this is the methodology that I would like to use. And so what we're thinking of doing is some work with political science departments in universities, for the time being in England, just to try and keep the sample manageable, but some work with them to establish who is doing this kind of teaching of those very early steps of the research design process, and how they are doing this teaching, and where and in what sort of institutions this is. And so maybe we'll find that there are newer, younger universities, shall we say, who, for various reasons, engage much more consciously and much more proactively in teaching those early stages of the research process. Where there are other universities who may think, well, our students are embedded in our department. They're happily strolling around, and they surely will pick this stuff up through osmosis, or they're already pretty good at this stuff anyway, so we don't need to teach them how to do a literature review. So that's that piece of work, and that's really motivated, as I said, by this interest in how well we are bringing people into the community of practice. And Kathy had the musical analogy. I have a a sporting version of it, which is that I used to be a rower, and then when I got a little too overweight for rowing, I switched to coaching, and I coached for quite a while. And something that I never really appreciated at the time in that world, which I now see perfectly, having now taught in the university, is all of this kind of soft education that goes on around the margins. So when a novice joins the rowing club, they're shown like this is how you pick an oar up so you don't bash something over there and chip it. This is how you strap your feet into the boat so you don't get wet. This is how you put a top on underneath your other top so you can take it off if it starts raining, and all these sorts of things. And all these sorts of things are peripheral to the main thing that they are being taught, which is how to row, but they combine to create, assuming that the novice can master all these things, they combine to create someone who will become up the chain, a competent and skilled rower, and maybe one day an international and a gold medal winner and whatever. But in teaching research methods and research design, it feels like we don't do very much of all of that soft peripheral stuff. So we don't help students get to grips with how to get to grips with the literature and how to approach potential supervisors. So that's one strand of the work. Another strand of the work, which is developing very early at the moment, this isn't very advanced, but the second strand is even less advanced, is thinking more directly about deficiency is too strong a word, but we'll say the deficiency in the way that we teach that sort of those sorts of soft skills, with the intersection between that and inclusivity. In that we have very many students in our department who are not from Anglophone academia. They didn't do their undergraduate degrees in English universities, and they haven't been trained in all of those sort of soft peripheral things. And so at various stages in their academic careers as postgraduates, they come up against things like, how do I even approach somebody to ask them about whether they could be my supervisor? And is it okay for me to stop them in the corridor, or should I book an office hour with them, and so on? Things that students who have come up through the Anglophone UK academic system know very, very well, just intuitively, just through having been socialized in those structures and in those places. And so another strand of work builds on these ideas of research design and research methods, and takes a slightly more kind of ethnographic slant. And I'm very interested in speaking to and working with students who have come into UK academia from overseas, and who are now, however competent they are at the nuts and bolts of politics and of public policy, however well they can recite Downs or crunch regressions or whatever it might be, find themselves a little bit sort of lacking confidence in all of those other areas, right? So where do I go to find literature on things? Who do I speak to do this sort of stuff? How do I even ask a question in the classroom? So that's another avenue of research that I'm very interested in, that I'm trying to put something together for at the moment.
Sounds like we will need to have you back on the podcast again in order to hear what the results are. Fascinating stuff. I wish we had time for me to ask some follow-ups, because I'm burning with all sorts of questions, but we're pushing against the time limits, as we always do. So another time we will explore that. Let me ask you just one final question, Kathy, before we wrap up, on your plans for the Centre for the Pedagogy of Politics. What are your further plans? What's coming in the coming months?
Right. Well, so we've got a fortnightly seminar series that we're doing. So anybody's interested in that, you can get in touch with us. And we're really excited. We're getting people sort of from around UCL and from other universities as well, which is great. If you'd like to present at that would be great. We're going to have a launch event in May, which hopefully is going to be a lovely day with some great speakers, as yet to be confirmed, with some food, COVID and everything permitting. And then for the future, I think we just really want to be a space where people can talk about the pedagogy of politics, and that might take various different forms. So hopefully our members will be supporting each other to bid for money, to do projects, to do research, to go and present that at conferences, to work together with our disciplinary networks such as the Political Studies Association Teaching and Learning Network and UAC's Teaching and Learning, and so on. We're going to have a website. We may very well want to do, this is further into the future, but we may want to think about things like running conferences, hosting a working papers series, that kind of thing. So we're sort of, it's very much early days, but we're excited.
Great. No, me too. This is fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how things develop here and how we can all get involved in the department in the activity of the centre. So thank you so much to Cathy Elliott and to JP Salter. And you can find the UCL Centre for the Pedagogy of Politics on Twitter. It's at UCL_CPP. You can also read about Cathy's art exhibition visit in her article Poverty at the UCL Art Museum, Situated Learning in a World of Images, and that's in RAISE, the Study Engagement in Higher Education journal, published in 2019. And we'll put all of those details in the show notes for this episode. Next week is Reading Week here at UCL, so we'll be having a little break, but we will be back in 2 weeks' time. We'll be looking from an Argentine perspective at the Malvinas-Falklands War, which took place 40 years ago this spring. As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.